Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the human lab rats part 2. Today we're talking about the Russian sleep experiment. As the scientists led the 5 prisoners of war into the cell and locked the doors, they would start releasing the experimental gas that they would be testing out. And for the most part, the first 3 days would go very exceptionally well. And it is said in this story that at first the prisoners of war would sit around each other talking about their families and just fond memories and just plans of what to do once they finish the program after 30 days. However, by day 6, things would start turning more grim and darker as the men would start talking about less warm memories and began talking about more darker memories, more specifically about their trauma and things they had seen on the battlefield. And this started alarming the scientists because it just happened out of nowhere, and they started speculating that this might have been a side effect from the gas. By day 9, however, things would start taking a downward spiral, and it's around this time that one of the prisoners of war would actually begin running from one end of the cell to the other end, screaming at the top of his lungs. And it is said that he would scream so loudly and so consistently that it would actually rupture his vocal cords to the point that his screams would only result into a very shallow squeak. While this was going on, the other prisoners of war would actually remain quiet during the entire time that the one prisoner of war was screaming. And it's also said that around this time that the other prisoners of war were becoming growingly paranoid of each other. And it was at this point that they no longer would talk to each other and they would just sit in silence. And around the time that the one prisoner of war would begin screaming, it is said that the other prisoners of war would actually start going over to the collection of books that they would have stacked in the corner. And they would begin tearing off the pages and defecating on them and smearing it on the two-way mirror that the scientists had so they could see through. It's also said that they would also take the same pages and do the same thing with the sink and turning the water on, flooding the room. Shortly after, the prisoners of war would plaster the pages over the two-way porthole that the scientists had to observe the prisoners of war. It said that the screaming would stop completely and it would just be complete silence. The scientists would check the microphones daily for 3 more days and had realized that the men were still alive in the room because oxygen was still being used in the room. In fact, they would say that it was so much oxygen, it would be equivalent to that of 5 grown men under strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the scientists would do something that they had promised that they would not do since starting the program, and they would use the intercom to provoke the prisoners of war to get a response, to just see if they were actually not dead or vegetables. And they would go over the intercom and say, "We're going to be opening the chamber to check the microphones. Everyone lay flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." But to this, they would only get one calm voice replying saying, "We no longer wish to be freed." The military forces that were funding the project would actually open the cell doors on the 15th day. And on the 15th day, the scientists started flushing the trial gas that they had been putting in the room and flushing the room with more oxygen. And upon doing this, they would hear 3 of the prisoners begging for them to turn on the gas. And the scientists would say it would be as if someone begging for the life of a loved one, just begging for them to turn on the gas. As the military rushed into the room, they would actually join in with the screaming that had just happened not that long previously, as the sight that they saw was much unsightly, as 4 of the 5 prisoners of war were actually alive. Although I don't really see how anyone could call it being alive in the state that they were in. There, the military would also notice that out of the food rations that they had in the room, nothing of it was touched past day 5. And on the dead test subject, they would notice that chunks of his thigh and chest was actually ripped off and stuffed into a drain. The other 4 prisoners of war also would have massive amounts of skin and muscle torn from their flesh. And it's said that their fingertips would actually be torn from the bone, which would indicate to the scientists and the military that the wounds were inflicted by hand and not by their teeth. The men would also have parts of their organs missing. And it's said that most of their organs would actually be removed from their bodies. Even their rib cages being exposed would be removed, and everything but the heart and lungs would be left intact. The military would be hesitant about sending the prisoners of war to seek medical treatment, but after much duress, they would finally go to retrieve the men out from the room. And it's said that even as torn up as the men were, they would fight like animals from being taken out of the room. And it's said that during this scuffle that one soldier would actually be killed by having his throat ripped out, while another one was gravely injured, while the prisoners of war would rip out his genitals. During this altercation and scuffle, one of the prisoners of war would actually bleed out, and they would manage to take the other 3 to a medical facility for treatment. And upon getting sedatives, the prisoners of war would actually flatline the moment that they would fall asleep. While the medical facility would be prepping the other 3 inmates for medical treatment, 2 of the 3 would actually pass away when being given sedatives as well. Essentially, the last remaining survivor would actually agree to go under surgery on the basis that they would not put a sedative in him, and he would actually go through this surgery without being put under. It's said as after the surgery was done, one scientist would be in the room, and as the doctors would be leaving, the doctor would scream at the top of his lungs and say, "You cannot leave me in the room with this thing," and would take a gun out and point it at the last remaining survivor and say, "What are you? I must know." The test subject would smile and say, "Have you forgotten? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free from the deepest part of your most animalistic minds. We are what you hide from in your beds every night and what you sedate from your dreams, where you sedate in silence and paralysis, where you go to that nocturnal haven that we cannot tread." The scientist would aim his gun and fire it at the subject's heart, where the EEG would flatline, as the last remaining survivor would choke out, so nearly free. And that does it for our story. And that's really what I think of this. It's just a very well written story. So until next time, stay safe, everyone.